we are joined by Nicola Mai from the University of Leicester. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very
round
much
of applause for the film. And people can turn their cameras back on and unmute themselves again. We have an in-person audience as well. It's in the Student Union. So if you all can unmute yourselves. But thanks so much. It's really such an excellent film. Let me briefly introduce you. I really like the bio that's on your Vimeo. So Nick Mai is a filmmaker, sociologist, and ethnographer. His films and research examine the relationships between gender, sexuality, migration in context of the global sex industry, where migrants find both self-realization and exploitation. Most migrants decide to work in the sex industry in order to have a better life and escape the forms of exploitation that they meet in other jobs. Humanitarian and governmental rhetoric often obfuscates this complex mix of opportunities and constraints by addressing all migrant sex workers as victims of trafficking and by enforcing restrictive and criminalizing measures that ultimately exacerbate their vulnerability to exploitation. His writing and films aim at breaking this vicious circle by bringing the understandings and experiences of migrants and their complex decisions and trajectories at the center of academic and public debates. So again, it's just such an excellent film. I think we met at a conference in Austria that was a conference on prostitution policy. I was researching my book about representations of sex workers in documentary, and you were screening a film there. Was it Travel, was the film that you were screening?
It was Samira.
Samira, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
And so maybe if I could start us off with a question about how you chose the self-reflexive format of this film. You've made ethno-fictional films before, like Samira, and in which you make a guest appearance in that one. So this is, I think, a different level of kind of reflexivity, showing the actors, the co-writers and co-editors reacting to their own parts on film. I really love those moments. So I'm curious how you arrived on that.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for inviting my film into your course and to Sex Week at the University of North Florida. I'm very proud of being here with you. And thanks to all of you for being here. Right, in relation to your question, I always wanted to find a cinematographic form to the way in which my films were done collaboratively. But the genre of ethnofiction came to me out of an ethical necessity and tension. The one between wanting to make sure that people who are directly concerned, like sex workers, own the terms of production, and then to show them the way in which they do, but also the necessity of protecting them from stigmatization and identification when they are also undocumented migrants. So in Samira, I managed to do that by using an actor to play the main role, and then validating the film throughout with the real character. In the case of Travel, which was written by 8 Nigerian women with experience of migration, sex work, and trafficking. What we decided was that the main role was played by a mixture of the people who wrote the film and the non-professional actresses. And then in Caer, I had the privilege of working with people who were also political activists and wanted to be seen, right? And so that's what changed. It changed that finally what I could do was to include them as themselves in the feedback section that the film was built through. And I really wanted to find a cinematographic way to reflect the collaborative methodology through which the film was done.
And you had mentioned before that there's elements also of like telenovela, in the sense that they're reacting to the drama that they're watching right in the beginning, of like, oh, I'd hit him over the head with a pan, that also adds this kind of feeling that you're part of a communal audience as you're watching the film as it's being constructed. And I love those moments. I mean, at the police car at the end, where it's sort of you hear then your voice directing them as they do a few more takes. It's just such an interesting reflexive approach.
Thank you. Well, that we really freaked out then, to be honest, because
with the police.
Yeah, because they were the real population. They were the real people, and we were in Jackson Heights on the right corner, if you know what I mean. So what were we doing in the car? The police can be very nasty in those situations, but of course, because of our whiteness and our academic credentials, we were able to just reassure them that everything was fine. But what would have happened if we weren't there? You know what I mean? That was a very real snapshot. It became quite a good one to show the relationship between the fictional and the real, and how they constantly intertwine throughout the production process.
Right. And that was my feeling as well about the Slut Walk march, right, where this is a real march, and and you could see there was some police presence actually. But if you could talk a little bit about how that part came together, and the role of, especially kind of, as you were talking about visibility, daytime public activism around that event.
Yeah, I participated in the first Trans-Latina Slut Walk in Queens in the previous year, in 2018. And I was like really mesmerized, and I was very inspired by what I had witnessed, because we are talking about an area of the city in which trans people are persecuted by the police for walking while trans, and they tend to also work at night, so away from public visibility. And we are talking about a very stigmatized group, because they're migrants, because they're trans women, and because they're Latina, so very intersectionally. So owning the street publicly, screaming, we are whores, we are sex workers, the street is ours, we are tired of police persecution, we are tired of police violence. It was so powerful. And what was also very powerful was to see the reactions of people, which was not hostile. There was some kind of admiration somehow about the courage that it took for them to occupy a public space in such an open way. Because of course, sex work is a secret in plain sight. Everybody knows where it happens. It's a huge economic sector, but for it to come out in the open was very powerful. And so I absolutely wanted to include that moment in the next reiteration in 2019, which is what happened. So the whole calendar of shooting was around that Friday. And so the filming, so that is a classic, if you want, observational documentary moment. That was not staged. It was something that was going to happen anyway. And what we did was we infiltrated a bit the bit at the beginning where they had a debate about what kind of themes they were going to discuss. But again, this is something that they had already planned doing. It's just that, we just filmed it, and we made sure that some of these issues were covered, which I discussed previously during the writing of the scenario of the script.
Right. And that conversation, touches on a number of really important topics, the limited occupational opportunities, the question of choice in sex work, and the reappropriation of a stigmatizing term like whore. I mean, there's so much built into that conversation. But I really like, it's nice to see the pedestrians and bystanders cheering them on in some of those moments in that march. And then the other part is the drag show. So I'm curious about how that was incorporated as well. Putting on a show, and then backstage. I think backstage at a show, showgirls talking is another one of these really communal moments.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, what we aimed to do was to have a representation of the multifaceted lives of people, right? Who are not only humanitarian subjects seeking asylum or people who identify through their work. There are also moments of leisure and of self-expression through the celebration of their cultural heritage and their songs and what they like. And so, but also this is real. Like drag shows are not an extraordinary instance in their life. Their lives is punctuated by drag shows, because many of them are performance, and so it's a job, but also it's a way to celebrate events in the communities, recurrences. And so we really wanted to include that, and having also more joyful and less engaged, like politically or antagonizing politically moment. And particularly the scene in the camerino, behind the scenes, was something that we had a nice discussion about, because I said, look, because they said, oh, we want to talk about this theme, for example, the injection of silicone, it's got the feature, and then we want to talk about the march. And I said, yeah, but what would you really talk about while you're during the makeup? Like, you're not going to talk about revolution, are you? You're going to talk about something else. And that's when they say, oh yeah, can we? And I said, of course you can. Like, you can talk about anything you want, and I said, but can we swear? And I said, like, yes, you can do whatever you want. Like, it's your film, because somehow, this kind of authoriality is something that had to be renegotiated, because in a way, as a director, the expectation is that you decide, right? So I had to constantly say, no, you decide. I'm providing the facility, and of course I am the director, but just in terms of directing the works, like, and providing a structure. So that's how it came about, and we had a lot of fun. Like, that scene could have lasted much longer. It was excruciating to edit it down, because some of the things they said were really, really hysterical, like really funny. Yeah. But then you can't keep everything in. That's the tragedy of editing. Thank God somebody else is in charge. Yeah. As a director, you really want to keep everything in.
Yeah. So I've asked you a couple questions, but I realize there's many people here who could also ask questions. Okay. People, I'm not fluent in Spanish, but you could also ask questions in Spanish. And we're joined by my colleague Ann Pfister, who's in the Digital Humanities Institute, who is also gave a brief presentation about participatory ethnographic research. So you may have a question.
Of course.
I see a question in the chat, actually. So what challenges did you face in making the film? Were there obstacles that you faced in making it? I mean, one of them, as you said, the expectations about the director being the one who writes the dialogue, etc. Seems like one, but were there others?
Yeah, the main challenge I faced was how to reconcile the fluidity of an ethnographic film and of a documentary, which in a way is supposed to follow, the people who are at its core, with the necessary rigidity of a fiction production. Yeah, if you want to have that quality, or an acceptable quality of production values that takes the film into a film festival, and which means that gives the people directly concerned visibility, then you need to have that structure. And it was very difficult to translate these different forms of filmmaking. And there's different logics, like the ethnographic logic that accommodates everything in relation to the act of observation, if you want, and makes it possible for people to participate to a set that begins at this hour and needs catering, and it's this and it's that, and also needs precise camera position. Because one of the features of ethnofiction is that it uses filmmaking as an act of gathering knowledge. So even during filming, for me, it was very important to allow people to move things around on set. So, for example, the scene of the arrest at the end, we had to change it completely, because the two protagonists said, this is never gonna, the way we had written it did not work at all in terms of the space where it happened. And they said an arrest would not really happen like this. They would come from here and they would do this and this and that. And so I learned a lot about what it means to be arrested, but and I was fascinated, but the director of photography was infuriated because they had to change all the cameras and lights, right? So that was the major difficulty. So I had to be breathing in very much and drink lots of water and listen to a lot of people ranting at me from all sides and carry it. Because I thought there was a vision at the end of the tunnel, and yes. I just tried to carry it,
Yeah.
And I would say that was the most difficult one.
A question also in the chat. Did anyone interrupt the production? With, for instance, like hateful speech? Was there that sense of no? Good.
No. Thank God, no.
I see my colleague Laura has a hand up.
Yes, thank you so much. Now I'm trying to figure out how to lower my hand. Okay. I was really struck at the end when, well, I love the whole final scene where they're sort of discussing the film and whether they want to make editorial changes to it. And I really appreciated the woman who was talking about how different but related it was to act a fictional part that was, you know, that was so representative of so many people's experiences, and how different, and I think she was implying kind of less traumatic it was to do that than to kind of continuously tell your story over and over again to therapists, social workers, and so on, and how much more, I mean, I take it that she was implying that this was in a way more cathartic, to play it in a fictional way than to kind of retell it again and again. So I was just really interested in that kind of juxtaposition between like narrativizing your story versus acting it out kind of in a fictional way.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, sorry.
And so that was like a comment, but then and whatever you have to say about that, I'm interested in hearing more about. And then I also wanted to ask about the woman who plays Jennifer. What was at stake for her in her sense that her story was different from Paloma's, and that the backstory hadn't been fully told? It seemed like there were some complicated kind of questions about there about citizenship, but also about you know, sort of choosing the work versus being forced into it, and then also really liking it, versus also, you know, like it seemed like there were some complicated questions that she was left with there.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for these comments. I will try to do justice to all of them. So the first one is about yes, like this is what Amy says at the end. She says that, you know, she kind of has a meta discussion saying that it is very difficult you know, verbalizing your story, like narrating your stories to a therapeutic kind of or legal audience, so to speak. And yeah, I also think what she was saying at the time was that it is different when you do it for yourself, when you are deciding yourself to do it, not because you need to save yourself from deportation, or because you know, you need therapy, or because you need therapy in order to save yourself from deportation, because the certification of PTSD is pretty much part of the recognition of your legitimate victimhood that then gives you entitlement to stay in the country. So even though it's very beneficial, sometimes it is seen as something that you have to do. And, you know, we all are resistant sometimes to therapy because you need to go to places which are uncomfortable, right? And in those cases, they are extremely traumatic. And so that's what she was saying. She was saying that, yeah, it was very different. And in a way, I was very glad when she said that, because particularly when Paloma was rehearsing, and when she was then you know, playing, she went very deep into her personal history. It wasn't always her personal history, but it resonated a lot, and I could feel in the voice that an emotional chord was being tapped. And so when then these debates were had, I felt reassured, because I did not want to contribute to another layer of secondary, you know, traumatization. And the observation of Jennifer, who played Rosa, was very interesting, I thought, because she felt that her character was not at the beginning, in the version that she saw, explained more in her complexity. What she wanted to be recognized is that she wanted two things. First of all, Jennifer is a very powerful political activist, and so she is very visible, and she participates in lots of initiatives in the community. And so she wanted to make sure that the message that even if you're Puerto Rican, it doesn't mean that you are recognized as a fully American citizen. And also, you're still going to be stigmatized for being trans. You're still going to be persecuted by the police for being a sex worker. So that's what you want to say. Yes, we are in a better position because we've got documents, but that doesn't eradicate or you know, transphobia and the phobia against sex work and persecution. But then she also wanted to talk about what is at the crux of contemporary debates about sex work, about these famous words of choice, right? Which is a very neoliberal and very useless concept, which presumes a broad variety of constraintless possibilities within one chooses to be a sex worker, in the same way in which one chooses to be a film star. And that's a very fictional representation of the ways in which people make decisions within constraints. So she wanted to make sure that her particular trajectory was being acknowledged. Well, what we did is that we left the comment as it was, but then we went back to the editing and provided a bit more information about her having been a nurse, a professional nurse, and then having had to give it up because of transphobia.
And that was a great point about choice. I mean, I think that is the crux of it, right? Is this kind of question of agency, the differences between sex work and trafficking, but also the nuances of discussions of agency. So, yeah, I see Anne has a question.
Sure.
Hi, hola, Nicolás.
Hola.
Bravo y muchas felicidades.
Gracias. Ay, gracias.
Pero a lo mejor cambio al inglés. Creo que la
¿Cómo
mayoría
quieres
están.
usted? Muy
Bueno,
bien, ¿cómo quieres usted?
I'm an anthropologist, as Nick, I think, mentioned, and I have a couple of comments and questions, really. One, I was a little bit, I'm sure you've heard this comparison maybe before, but I was reminded of Don Kulik's Travesty. Are you familiar with that book?
Yeah, the book, yeah, of course.
So I actually see some interesting parallels in methods and some of the like the ethical dilemmas potentially and other things. And so one of the comments I wanted to make is that, you know, in anthropology, we're often working with marginalized groups, and the idea of anonymity is so layered into anthropology. If you ever work with an IRB, for example, the default position is that we have to protect the anonymity of our participants. And I work with deaf youth and their families in Mexico City. It's different, right? But they're also activists, right? Many of the people that I'm working with are activists, not all of them. But when given a choice, it's interesting that you were also talking about choice. Many times participants don't want to be anonymous, right? And I also work with visual methods and photo voice and film to a lesser degree. And so I just wanted to bring up that point. It's a really important one, that oftentimes our participants, not only in activist kinds of contexts, but they don't want that anonymity that we're in some ways kind of paternalistically assuming they want and need from us, right? That said, we cannot, you know, we can't discard the positions, right? That's part of our ethical obligation as well. But it's an interesting point of this idea of, you know, the anonymous kind of fly on the wall, you know, researcher. So the point that I was bringing up, so the book that I mentioned is Travesty. I don't know that I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's about
Travesty. It's about Brazil.
In Brazil, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And so I've read parts of that, the introductory chapter that talks about methods in particular. I've read with students in classes in my cultural anthropology class, for example, with undergrads. And one of the comments that I often get in my classes is that students don't want to learn about trans women just in these sex worker kinds of scenarios. That's a fair comment. And I just wanted to kind of bring it to the group and I guess sort of workshop that idea, because I see it as valid. I see it as a real concern. Your idea of kind of showing this group, like here's the group experience, and then within that there are all these individualities. I mean, that's part of ethnography as well, right? As we're trying to look for sort of the patterns, but also maintaining that individuality of ethnography and these individual voices, which you did beautifully in the film.
Thank you.
And then I'll be quiet now, but I also wanted to say Caer as like the name of the film also references to me a little bit of like falling in love. And we were really able to fall in love with the women. And so I think that for me, that Caer has a different kind of representation really for this film too. So felicidades, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a usted. Thank you very much for these reflections. Yeah, I mean, when I get comments like this, I feel a bit less lonely about having to navigate these, IRB cages and all of these fictional, really, understandings of how research pans out. If you want to understand anything meaningful, they're still pretty much, even though the intentions, of course, are good in most cases, they are pretty much predicated on ethnographic distance and anonymity as the best vantage point from which to understand. Whereas as ethnographers, we know very well that it's only by going closer and negotiating proximity that we can understand things together with the people that we are doing research with. So I see research as a co-construction, and in this case, I was very privileged to be with the women in the film, because they also wanted to explore that together. Yeah, it was really a process of dialogue that enabled us to do what we did. So yeah, I mean, it's in this time, because of the powerfulness of their voices and of their political subjectivity, I thought we could take, and because also the film was separate from the IRB of the project that funded it, if you want, that kind of framed it more than funded it, then we could have more of a leeway. But normally I counted it so many times that people said, oh no, you can record me, you can put the camera on, and then I just had to say, I can't, I can't record you. So I'm glad I found a way to manage that. As far as falling in love with the women, well, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it was something that it was something that really happened to me. I really also admired the courage very much of embodying that of embodying that life and having to really fight every day just to be, and to resist that level of stigma every day, just for being who they are. I mean, and wanted to have the life that they wanted. And they were very clear as well that they were tired of being associated with sex work necessarily in representation. Some of them in that debate, some of them really didn't like the word puta. They thought it was self-stigmatizing, and they wanted to move away from it. And then others said, like Jennifer said, yeah, I learned to like my job and to love my job, but what else, what other possibility did I have? Why couldn't I? And then Carolina says, why couldn't I work as a, peluquera, like a hairdresser or anything? She actually wants to do movies, So that is the kind of dilemma of agency which they embody, needing to defend their decision of their very constrained decision of doing sex work, but also recognizing the limitations that are cast upon that decision, defending trafficking as a reality for them without being reduced to a victim. This is what we tried and they tried to do in the film, because they really, because trafficking is also a reality for them. And even though it is complicit, the trafficking kind of humanitarian narrative and mechanism with deportation and humanitarian bordering, it is also something that gives people papers and gives people, dignity in terms of being safe and in a place where they can sell themselves through the law.
Thank you. It is, there are so many complexities around all these issues.
Thank you.
I see someone was also asking about whether there's plans for something like a sequel to this, or what your future plans are, since it sounds like you're also, working out new modes of this kind of participatory documentary.
Yeah, I mean, I decided after having done this film that I will always do participatory collaborative films. That's my passion. And there was supposed to be a sister film to Caer, which is Plan B, which exists and is being edited now. And we were supposed to, we wrote it exactly the same way with a fantastic collective of Chinese women working in the sex industry in Paris, France. But then COVID hit. And so the film became a very different one, and this is going to be the next film of mine to be released in by the end of the year, hopefully. The film became a Zoom meta discussion about the script, and then some of the scenes were illustrated, and then some cameras, because this was at the beginning of September, towards the end of September 2020. So COVID was starting to raise its ugly head again. And so what we could do was to get some cameramen with 3 women and have mini portrait. And so the film is an assemblage of this. It's very different from Caer insofar as there is no fiction in terms of mise en scène and all of that. But the collaborative aspect is the film, because the film is a debate between us on why we wrote that scene and all of that. So hopefully it's going to be interesting in that respect.
Yeah, I'll post your Vimeo page in the chat for people to check out the other films and maybe see. I think maybe Plan B is on there as well. Yeah, I have questions for you about where this is shown. So I think I saw it in the New Fest in New York, which is an LGBT film festival, and you said it played at Outfest as well.
It played at Outfest Fusion, which I was immensely proud of, because it is a festival, a LGBTQ+ festival for people of color, and I was very, very proud that the film was recognized in that festival because of its decolonial focus, and because that meant that we were on the right track in terms of collaborative methodology. So it was there. It was a Vancouver Queer Film Festival, and the community there celebrated it as well. And then it was at Sheffield, which is a bit more of a mainstream but big film festival in the UK, and it was a New Fest in New York. And it was my dream for the film to be at New Fest in New York, because New Fest is the LGBTQ+ film festival in New York City, and the film is pretty much an ode to marginal New York, if you want, from Queens into looking at Manhattan, or not really, because Queens doesn't really need Manhattan very often, It's a very big place.
And you had mentioned the Jean Rouch festival, which is very exciting.
Yes, that's happening on the 5th of May. So there's going to be an encore screening of the film in New York on the 23rd of March.
Oh, wow.
Right now. So I think it is still possible to get access to that. I am fantasizing about going there, but it's in the middle of teaching, and hopping from London to New York is not exactly something that you can do very quickly while preparing PowerPoint presentations and navigating COVID and all of that. But I might try. But then on the 5th of May is going to be in Paris at the Jean Rouch Film Festival, which I'm very proud of, actually, because it's Jean Rouch, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so I am a fan, a groupie, I would admit, of Jean Rouch, shamelessly. And so for a film to be accepted there it means a lot.
Yeah. So for those who some film students of mine are here, Jean Rouch is the pioneer of cinema verite, famous for a film called Chronicle of a Summer, which also has an audience feedback at the end, which is a really remarkable experiment with that format. And then I guess we have a little bit of time left. I'm curious if there are other films that influenced the style of this, or that you feel depict kind of trans or sex workers in a way that inspired you, or that you would recommend. I mean, I know I was thinking of Paris is Burning as a New York film that also talks about sex work of women of color. There's like Peer Kids is another one. Kiki is another one that I think are important in terms of ballroom, and that do talk quite a bit about trans women's experiences and criminalization.
Yes, but all of this, of course, is true. But for me, Tangerine is the one that really touched me, really inspired me in the narrative style, and also because of the kind of street and very credible representations. I don't know, it felt really it felt like a documentary,
Mhm.
I think that it was amazing, that film. So
Yeah.
I had that at the back of my mind. Of course, that it's an LA film. Paris is Burning it's a seminal movie. Who can forget that? I used to go voguing in clubs in London at the time, and I remember when we saw that film, it blew our mind. We were all kind of really influenced by it beyond the theme. It was seminal. So yeah, but Tangerine more closely, I think it's something that made me reflect on what I wanted the film to be like and look like and feel like. That's what I wanted the film to feel like.
Yeah, and Sean Baker, I think he's an interesting example of someone who had kind of an ethical researcher contract with Maya Taylor and Kiki Rodriguez in that film, where they, helped write the script, and they said, we have two conditions for doing this film. Number one, you have to show the kind of brutality of this experience of sex work on the street and criminalization. But number two, it has to be funny. And it has to be enjoyable to the women themselves, and not just for people outside this world. So, and he said that was a tough thing to balance, right? Is like, and I think your film does a similar thing in the sense of, yes, you want to show kind of narratives of victimization and encounters with the law, but also you want to show the kind of joy and sisterhood and all the elements of in jokes and humor that you get in a dressing room or in the communal watching of the film,
which are so important in the reality of the people directly concerned. Every marginalized population, has a code and has a humor and a banter that allows them to just discharge all the stress and to create a sense of belonging. There are essays by Tila Sanders, for example, talking about humor as a community building, and also as a way, to differentiate between in and out group, right? Between people who are in sex work, who can laugh about it because they are part of it and they know exactly how to laugh about it, and people who shouldn't because they should know better because it's not their thing, it's not their life.
Right. So I guess that was the other question of like in-group and out-group. I've noticed that definitely there's within sex work activism, right? There's conversations about decriminalization and the difference between decriminalization and legalization, but it can be hard to explain those nuances. And I know Decrim New York has done a great job with that. So I'm curious if the collective, the Intercultural Collective, or others who organized the march, what their perspective is on kind of how to get the word out and what language people can understand.
Well, Jennifer says it in the film. She says that we are for decriminalization because if you legalize the sex industry, then only people who are legally resident in the country are going to be able to benefit from it. And we are a collective. I'm just amplifying their voice by saying we. That's what she says. We are a collective that defends the right of undocumented migrants. So how could we support something that creates two layers of legality and that would push further underground, as it did in Holland, for example, people who are more fragile and more vulnerable socioeconomically, right? So legalization, of course, is desirable if it is a decision that people can make, but not if you then impose legalization on people who are already illegalized by the system. Then it becomes counterproductive. So they are for decriminalization of all laws criminalizing sex work.
Yeah. And they mention FOSTA SESTA, they mention ICE. I mean, there's a lot of other, like they talk about online, right? I think there's one line, it's kind of brief, but she says like the websites are down and so we have to find work otherwise. So I think that's another part of that provides the context here, is that however well-meaning, anti-trafficking actually just narrows the ability to communicate and to be safe. So I think that's the other kind of context here. But it can be, at least in my experience, hard to explain that to people who, for whom the victim narrative about trafficking is a very compelling one. There's a number of far more films, I will say, that are about the victim narrative of trafficking, find a bigger audience, find more funding, or more directly tied to laws passing in the U.S.
But I think this is like the representational universe that frames sex work as a topic is goes very deep. It goes into foundational stigma, like the whore stigma, against which all women need to defend themselves in order to be respectable and honorable. And so, you know, and this is why everybody finds it easier to accept that a woman, you know, would do something like that, which is so dishonorable or constructed socially as that under duress than as a decision in terms of labor opportunities, constrained as they might be. You know, I interviewed a lot. This is actually my work. It's about labor migration. And I interviewed a lot of migrants, women, cis men, trans women, who told me that they would rather work in the sex industry than do their exploitative 9-to-5 mainstream jobs they were offered to. So if we want to make sure people have so-called neoliberal choices, then we should probably reform the labor market and make sure that there are non-exploitative opportunities out there, instead of only targeting the least exploitative opportunities under a moralizing guise. You know, this is the paradox we are navigating.
Yeah. And could you talk a little bit about the T visa and specifically the trafficking courts in New York? I know there's good reporting on it by Kate Diadamo and Melissa Jarrett Grant. They have been in the courtrooms talking about, especially with Chinese migrant women, the sort of the barriers that they experience in those courtrooms.
Well, I didn't expect for us to get the authorization to shoot in the tribunal. It's a very interesting It's a very interesting reality, the one of the human trafficking intervention courts, because although it's part of the judiciary system, and so they deal with arrests and they do not challenge these arrests in terms of, you know, taking a stance. How could they? They're part of the judiciary. But it is a benevolent institution, nevertheless, by offering, under the guise of anti-trafficking, at least alternative to detention. So it's a very interesting and complex institution. And so the judge, the Honorable Sarita, you know, authorized us to shoot there to show that complexity. To show that complexity, we had discussions saying that, yeah, you know, in the current situation, in a way, the human trafficking intervention courts operate as some kind of harm reduction. That's the way they operate. And it's interesting that during the Trump years, particularly at the beginning, I started targeting people in the courts themselves. These are defendants. These were potential victims of trafficking who then did not turn up to very crucial, you know, hearings in order to defend their cases, with the risk of having a warrant. If you don't turn up to a hearing, you know, you can have a warrant, you get a criminal record, and there goes your possibility of getting papers and dignity, you know. So we saw all that happening, and we also saw during the research project that framed the research, but we also saw the effects of Sesta Foster. We were doing ethnography in the streets of New York on a very rainy night, and there were only young trans women of color down in the streets who used to have adverts on lines, and they had to make their ends meet, and they were there facing, of course, you know, not only the weather, but most importantly, decriminalization and a very racialized and persecutive police regime. So, you know, no matter what the intentions are, the implications and impacts of these laws is very, very negative on the lives and rights of people who are directly concerned, particularly the most racialized and vulnerable strata of the sex work industry.
Yeah. No, I think that scene in the courtroom, it's also really important that you have someone who can sit next to you and can say, okay, I'm here. Here are the organizations that I'm going to put you in touch with. I know a lot of people who've been part of those in migration courts and also specifically the trafficking courts. It can be a very, I think, isolating and terrifying moment. So it is really important that that's the way that it's framed.
You're not lonely. This is actually the legacy of Lorena Borjas. You know, that's what she used to do before she set up. Lorena started distributing condoms at the height of the HIV and AIDS pandemic, and she started, you know, weaving the, you know, the basis for the trans Latino community in Queens and beyond. And then she had a bail fund, you know, so that a community fund that would allow people to be bailed out instead of spending nights in jail unnecessarily and be at risk of victimization while they were in custody. But what she said as well, which really touched me when I met her, was that at least las chicas, they know that que no están solas, they know they're not alone. Que tienen a alguien que le quieres, that they have somebody who loves them.
Yeah.
So that's very basic. Like, you're there in a foreign country, you don't speak very well the language, you're there in this big institution in your country, you have dramatic experience of law enforcement, and suddenly there is somebody who is trans like you, who speaks your language, who just is there with you. That's so important.
Yeah.
So important.
Yeah. So could you talk just briefly about the sex HUM, like this, the project that this is part of, the larger research project?
Yeah, it ended in September 2020, and it took place in Australia, New Zealand, France, and the United States. And the aim was to compare different regimes of criminalization or decriminalization in framing sex workers. So New York was chosen exactly because of the Human Trafficking Intervention Courts, and we drew on the findings of Red Umbrella Project, and of Kate D'Adamo, and of other sex work scholars. And then we also focused in LA in the US, but the idea was to study different degrees of criminalization from New South Wales, where sex work is completely decriminalized, not completely, but very close to being completely decriminalized, to the point that there are very few trafficking cases, and that people have the options of changing the establishment in which they work, because they've got papers. For example, you can be on a student visa and work 20 hours a week, and you can work in a brothel. So if a client bothers you, you can just call the police on the client, and they do, and the client is just is just taken to court. Yeah. And then New Zealand, which is wrongly, I have to say, hailed as the example of decriminalization, but New Zealand does not decriminalize migrants. And so there is a disparity there between the regime of rights, which is available to Kiwis, to New Zealanders, which is excellent, because in New Zealand, actually, street sex work is also completely decriminalized, which is different from New South Wales. But at the same time, migrants are not decriminalized under Section 19 in order to protect them from trafficking again. So the T word comes back again. Yeah. And that unexpectedly was one of the places which was most difficult to conduct the research, because people were there on a short term, they didn't inform communities, and the police was really cracking down. It's a small country of 4 million. So it's very difficult to get lost. It's not like New York or Miami, where, it's very difficult for you to keep track of everybody. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and then France, because of the Nordic model, because France implemented the criminalization of clients. So we worked together with Médecins du Monde, Doctors of the World, and we did a community-based research that documented the disaster that is for people's lives and rights, because you basically don't allow people to make a living by making it impossible for law-abiding clients to come, and leaving a lot of space and pushing the industry underground, basically. So paradoxically, you give a lot of power to abusive clients by criminalizing the good ones. And then the US, of course, because unfortunately it is where humanitarian and repressive laws are distributed at a global scale through the trafficking, tipped, how is the acronym? Trafficking Index Report.
Yes, in which we get to give a report card to every other country.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So that was the idea.
Great. So I think we're out of time, but again, it means so much to me for us to talk about this in kind of the U.S. legal framework, and for you to talk as a criminologist, but also as an ethnographer. So let me just share in the chat. We had a nice introduction by Manny earlier of Sex Week and Sex Week events at our campus. And I'm just really thrilled. This is the 5th year, and it really means a lot to me that in the UNF calendar, I got the sex industry and the rights and justice of trans women working in that industry in our calendar and not censored. So it means a lot. Thanks very much, Duan, for your help and for your help. And thanks to my department for sponsoring this event. Nick, this is a really wonderful conversation, and we really loved your film. So thanks very much.
Thank all of you for the attention you gave to my work, and I'm really glad you fell in love with the Rosa Paloma and all las otras chicas as much as I did. And thank you for everything. I'm really proud of being part of Sex Week.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Bye. Take care.
Bravo.
See you.
Ciao.
Ciao. Bye.
Ciao. Ciao. Bye. Bye.